This is the Heritage Series with 786. I'm sitting with Advocate Rehana Khan Parker. Welcome to the show.
Oh, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am delighted to be on this Heritage Series. And just for the record, I am Rehana Khan Parker, an attorney by profession.
It's so nice to have you here, and it's very exciting to speak about heritage from an Indian perspective, because I think that because we are sort of a minority in South Africa, it does the story does get pushed aside a little bit. So I'm very interested in hearing more about what you have to say about the Cockney Heritage Society and what that's all about. But before we get started, I just want to know, what according to you personally is heritage?
Okay, thank you. That's an absolute wonderful question. And also thank you for narrowing it down to the Cockney Indian heritage, because when we talk about Indian heritage, it's very wide. So yes, what I understand heritage to be is that which is handed down from generation to generation. That is something that is bequeathed from one generation to another through language, culture, the way we cook and the way we dress. Now, your heritage is defined by where you come from, where you've lived, and what has shaped you in that environment. And heritage is a continuous evolvement. If you think of us as Indians or South Africans of Indian descent, or South African Indians of Cockney descent, we dress very differently to our heritage going back in India. So, and that is because we have evolved. And that is what makes heritage so important, because it is living. And today, the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture has just released its Living Heritage series, where they are celebrating living heroes, living heroines. And I think that is what I understand to be heritage.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the Cockney community and how they've come about in South Africa and what heritage means to them?
Yes, I think of the Indian diaspora. The Cockney community was one of the last, I would say, that have come. So I'm a first generation South African Indian of Cockney descent. And that goes for many others of the Cockney community. In total, the total Indian population that makes up the population statistics of South Africa is about 2%. Now that's a lovely number. At one stage, the total Indian population outside India was the highest in the world here in South Africa. I'm not so sure if that is still the case. We might have been overtaken by Canada or the UK. When it comes to the Indian Cockneys and how we came here, as opposed to Indians from other parts of India who came as indentured labourers to work on the cane fields in KZN, our forefathers, or my father, or perhaps your forefathers, if you're not the first generation South African, came as traders. So that is how they largely came. So they come from a region in India. It's on the coast of Malabar. That's what the coast is, just south of Mumbai, somewhere between Mumbai and Goa. So that's the coastline that the Cockneys of South Africa has hailed from. So traditionally they came as traders, and records show at our National Archives in Ruland Street, and you will see several other groups always posting about when their forefathers had come, was in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Some, however, like my father, didn't come as a trader. He came as a teacher. In 1948, in fact, the Urdu teacher of this Grassy Park Sunni Ahmed Masjid here in Grassy Park, Imam Zalgonka, the deceased Imam Zalgonka, came in 1949 as well to come and teach Urdu. Because at that stage, teachers were very few and far. Very few people were educated in the, I'm talking about the Cockney Indians, were educated. So what they did was they obtained a permit from the South African government. Obviously, they had to try it in 47s already. My dad came in 1948 under a permit through the union, coming via the UK because they had very strange passport controls at that stage. So, and that is how I believe Imam Zalgonka, the late Imam Zalgonka, had also come. So they had come here. Some came as teachers and mostly came as traders. That was the continuum for a long time until the apartheid government put a lid on people coming and being able to leave India to come and work here.
Yes.
And it affected their spouses because they couldn't bring their spouses along. Because unfortunately, I think if I stand under correction, but I don't think Imam Zalgonka's wife came either. Neither could my father's wife, because in 1948, we have a new apartheid government who now put a clamp on all spouses traveling, accompanying their partners from India. So he couldn't get the permission to bring his wife here. I'm talking about my dad. So those are the kind of challenges that we had.
Yeah.
Fortunately, 1994 opened the floodgates again.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say floodgate, opened the doors again, where spouses could then come, and come to South Africa.
And families could
so
be
that's the kind of diaspora that we have. Largely traders with a sprinkling of teachers. There are many others. There's the Dadikas, there's Ahmed Sapfaki. We essentially came either here or they came to the Habibia College. It's a primary school, but it was called a college back then. So there was a whole import of teachers to come and teach the Urdu vernacular in Cape Town. But with that, and I can use my father's example perhaps, it was not just about talking about Urdu, because India had just emerged out of its colonial past. And slap bang, he lands in South Africa and goes back to another colonial past, of course this time under apartheid. So teaching was not just teaching Urdu in the classroom, it became a political classroom.
Yes, of course. Can you tell me a little bit more about how being part of a diaspora affects your idea of heritage?
Yes, so I've been installed to be very proud of who I am, proud of my culture, proud of my identity, proud of my traditions. And I think I pay all credit to my father. He always instilled in us the love for where you had come from, but respecting that we had a greater role to play in South Africa. So at a given point in time in our history, and why the Cockney community was mobilized through a Facebook page a few years ago, was because in the old days, when you had the traders that were here and the teachers that were here, they were a vibrant community. They kept the culture and the tradition going, and they were involved in a range of activities. And there was a publication called the South African Indians Who's Who. That was not just for Cockneys, it was for all Indians across South Africa. And what they did was record each one's snapshot history, and the thread through all of that, probably your grandparents would be featured in there as well. The activities were multifold. So they were involved with masjids, they were involved with hunger appeal, they were involved with education. Politics somehow never crept in there. Somehow that was never captured, but I understand why it was not captured, because we are talking about apartheid, so they couldn't publicly advertise their activities. So that was what happened in I would say largely 1948 right through to probably the 80s. You would find that it was that kind of activity amongst the Indian Cockney diaspora, Indian diaspora, and South African indigenous people. Because nobody celebrated their culture, because they were too busy fighting a bigger enemy, which is apartheid. There wasn't time to introspect on who am I in terms of my culture and my traditions. And you had then seen over the years, and probably in the last 20 years, that there is this resurgence of now wanting to know who am I, where do I come from, why do I pronounce my words in a particular way, why do I cook this way? And people are now delving back into the past. You see it amongst indigenous people as well. You see it amongst the Khoi, you see it amongst the San, you see it amongst African people. They are now going back into publicly celebrating their heritage dressing in their heritage, singing their songs and their language. So to capture living heritage, I had found it was necessary to mobilize a group of Cockneys, although it says Cockneys of Cape Town, but it's actually Cockney diaspora throughout South Africa, just so that we can reconnect with our past, rewrite our stories, which has never been written, which has probably been handed down from generation to generation. And a great role of keeping that together, I think, centered around music. So if I and I always like to compare, although it's not a good example in a certain respect, is to compare the Malay community to the Indian community in terms of how culture and tradition has eroded or disappeared, not through any fault of our Malay people at all. It was the system that robbed them of their culture and their identity. So amongst the Cockneys, since we are still largely first generation, I'm talking my age group, and whilst we still maintain that contact with India, we understand the words and we understand the cuisine and the traditions. Let us capture that living heritage, because if we don't do that, it's going to be lost with the next generation. And you know, to try and delve into the past 300 years ago is difficult, to trace your roots and to understand exactly which city you hailed from wherever in the world. So coming back to music, so music probably, I think, music, and let me turn to Maulud as well, I mustn't forget about Maulud in this masjid. So music is probably the one, I think, the one level that kept the language alive right throughout times. Because if there's something that connected you with the past, and I think of my father, was always singing a song that he had learnt at school. And it would be a Bollywood song, you know. And that then continued into, of course, the Bollywood era, which was very, very prevalent in the 1970s. And the music of Muhammad Rafi, as well as Lata Mangeshkar and Jagjit Singh, became very popular. And that had a positive spillover effect on our youngsters. And then with the popularization of Bollywood, of course, even people who were not Cockney, who were not Indian, enjoyed Bollywood. So there you have, all of a sudden, a part of the culture that is kept alive, almost like in Japan. Japan has kept its heritage alive. How? Through anime. You know, the use of anime is amazing. How they've captured the youth to understand the heritage of Japan. So I think in that, Bollywood has done us a favor in terms of keeping our language alive. As well as, Fatima, you do know that we've got intermarriages. I mean, the question of only an Indian marrying an Indian was left like probably 4 decades ago. And so now we have an evolvement of the Cockney diaspora. So you've got this whole cross-cultural hybrid, which makes us absolutely a wonderful set of Rainbow Nation. And to be able to expose those who do not hail from an Indian descent or a Cockney descent, music definitely played a role. I said I needed to speak about Maulud. So there's one thing, and one sees it with regard to the Malay community. If there's one thing that had kept the banner of Islam alive, was the dhikrs, because as we do know, they could not practice their faith openly. So they found a way through reciting the dhikrs in various melodious forms that it didn't sound like dhikr. We know that. So when it comes to the Indian diaspora, they also celebrated lots of festivals with India. And I'm not talking festivals as in a music festival. I'm talking about the Urs Sharif, which is a celebration of a saint, or of course our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And we're going into Rabiul Awwal shortly. So what the Indian diaspora, and especially now I'm talking about the Cockney community, is they brought their dhikrs along with them. They dhikr, and they would call it Garwi Sharifs, or they would call it Maulids, and they would hold it in homes, very much like you would have the Khatam Sharifs every Thursday night. So that is what they did, and annually, depended upon which Karamat or Awliya they celebrated or commemorated, they would then have the Urs. One feature, though, of the, I cannot speak for the other Indian communities, but I can speak for the Cockney community, that has certainly permeated very well, and that is the commemoration of Imam Hassan and Hussein of Karbala, the 10 days of Muharram. So various Cockney communities in South Africa would have the Majlis programs, and that's been for years. And I've noticed that has now this resurgence. So I think they kept that, largely, they kept that alive. Might have happened in other communities as well, but I am not aware of it. Or perhaps it did, but on a very small scale. And then, of course, coming back to Mawluds, the beautiful part of the Mawlud amongst the Cockney community is that the Mawlud is recited in Arabic as well as Urdu. So my father, having been the Urdu and the Arabic teacher at Habibia, had countless students whom he taught the Naats, Hamd and Mankabats, which is the praises of the Prophet, praises of Allah in the Urdu vernacular, whether it was from the students in District 6, in fact, his one student just passed on, Mariam Upare, or the Ajam family in Simonstown. So the language was also kept through in terms of the Quran khatams, in the terms of the Garwi Sharifs, the Urs celebrations, as well as the Mawlud Sharifs.
I'm really glad that you mentioned music. And something that I'm really interested in is how do we, as now a diaspora that has now settled here, how do we, as times change and locations change, preserve that heritage other than music and spiritual festivities?
Yes, good question. I think you've really packed me with good questions this morning. Yes, I think I've stated in right at the beginning that heritage evolves all the time. I already said the way I dress now is certainly not a reflection of my Cockney heritage, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, because heritage is living and it continues. What we do want to do is record what has happened in the past as an example for the future. Now, why do I say that? Because not all pasts are good. So we want to learn from the wrongs of the past, redress those wrongs, and ensure that going forward we do not repeat those mistakes. So heritage has, going back into heritage gives us that nuance to understand what happened in a particular point in time and the context, and how can we redress it differently. So I do see that celebrating your heritage in your particular way, where you are finding yourself now, in your environment, in your country, and the way that evolves is shaped by where you are. My children don't want to eat the traditional Indian food called sora and bombil, which is the dried shrimps. They want to eat pasta. But the grandmothers in the house, I mean, they don't want to look at the pasta. So that's part of an example of how we have evolved. Another example, perhaps, which I need to bring, which I think is always a sore point, is that we always frown on a woman wearing the red sari or the veil with the garland flowers in front, saying it's a Hindu tradition. But we don't frown when the woman wears a white dress and a ring on the left finger. So one must be very careful how one criticizes history, because not all traditions are bad. There are very, very good traditions. And then one point I think I need to mention amongst the Cockneys. Cockneys from Corken are largely Muslim, that we know. But there are people from Maharashtra and the Konkan district that are not Muslim. And we mustn't forget about that as well. So you cannot equate heritage and culture with religion. It just happens to be that most of the Cockneys, in fact all the Cockneys in South Africa, are Muslim. But if I go back to India, the Konkan region does not only consist of Muslims. So we mustn't confuse, and there's often that confusion between heritage and culture. In our instance, it happens to be one and the same. Heritage, religion, and culture happens to be the one and the same, but it's not always the same.
And so you did mention a few names just before this, and it makes me wonder, what are other families within Cape Town that are very predominant and well known that have really contributed to preserving the heritage?
Preservation and conservation of heritage is important to understand the next generation, and as a reference book for the next generation. And as I had stated earlier, we need to ensure that we record our living heritage whilst our predominant figures are alive. Now, there are certain people that stand out who have certainly preserved our Cockney heritage or our Indian heritage for people who are of Cockney descent. And if I use, for example, I'll start with education. I've already mentioned several names already who came to Habibia College. I've mentioned Imam Zalgonka that came to teach you Urdu. There's Ruqayya Appa Nordin, who passed away, was also an Urdu teacher at the school, as well as Maulana Mohsin Zalgonka and his wife Nasima Zalgonka. So those are, I think, some of the individuals who had kept up the language from a preservation of history. I think there's one person that stands out, and that is the late Dr. Ali Mate. He recorded so many stories about India. There's a book that he has also penned on the history of Kokans in South Africa. And I think he stands out among, through I'm talking about recording history and telling the stories. As a young person, unfortunately he has passed on too early. Then when it comes to music, I think the only name that immediately comes to me is Dada Parker. I mean, I remember as a young girl going to Dada Parker's house with my father because they were practicing some song or some Qawwali show and so forth. Largely it was him. There's also the Kasker family. Let's not forget Ibrahim Kasker and his brothers that brought the Sabri brothers to South Africa. And then through time and recently, I think in living history, in living heritage, I think it is largely Nisar Pangaka that brings artists from India. So from a music point, I think that is it. From a cuisine point of view, South Africans of Cockney descent, there are many that have written books. Najmunisa Parker, there's the Haneker lady, and there are several of them. Many of our cooks who preserved the Cockney heritage in terms of cooking has passed on. They were largely male. One was called the Basjoni, and he would cook the food. Our living heritage heroes are Mr. Naka and several other people, and now I'm going to start forgetting names, and then I'm going to be in trouble. From a political angle, there were few. When I'm talking about a political angle, I'm talking about those that were for the liberation struggle. There were few. I think Aisha Bibi Dawood of Worcester definitely stands out. She to me stands out. The Jaffer family, I'm talking about the late Sulaiman Jaffer, Dr. Julie Jaffer, Zubaida Jaffer, I'm talking about that family. My father, Gulzar Khan, being the last councillor for District 6 and a councillor for the ANC and an ANC veteran. Poet, how can I forget Mr. Kays, who was incarcerated for 6 years with no pay, and the community took care of him. He was a poet. Let me think who else. Gosh, now I'm going to be in trouble. Dawood Khan as well, of Kensington. And of course, just recently, I think we need to acknowledge Hisham Muhammad, who was an advocate. There's also, I know Tasneem Khan's father, I know his name is Dawood, I can see his picture, I just can't come to the name at the moment. But Tasneem Khan, if you hear me, you know exactly who I'm talking about, it's your father. So we do have lots of heroes and heroines in our community. Farida Khan Ricketts, a living heritage, still alive. So there are many examples of those that played a pivotal role in the political domain. That includes, now names are coming back to me, that includes the late Councillor Parker. So he too was and the Hussein Parker that was an advocate. And of course now they're all just flashing and I need to say all the names. So there were many, and I think we need them their families to tell their stories.
Yes. And, that brings me to my next point, which is our community struggles quite a bit with speaking about the past and speaking about the difficult experiences. What advice would you give to our community to encourage them to speak more to the current generation about what happened back in the day and how that affects us today?
That is so important. We are resilient and we forget so quickly, and that's the problem. I think going back to 76, I knew exactly where I was at the school, and there was the pallets coming. But we forget that because we are resilient. But it's important to tell the story. And I would encourage, young people to sit with their parents and ask them for however painful. However, you will also know that with the pain comes a lot of happy stories, stories that we need to celebrate. And if it's painful stories, hear them out. But I think we need to I've noticed that people are just lazy. They they want you to write their story. They don't want to tell their own story. And I think it's very important for the next generation. My children cannot quite identify how beaches where the oceans are all open were separated. So one has to take them back to the classroom. And more importantly, to capture the last, I think 20 years in South Africa is also important, to capture this living heritage now for going forward. I think a lot can be done at school level. I think there should be more emphasis on heritage at school, getting children to write the stories of their parents and not wait for obituary columns to tell the story. So yes, I'm a great storyteller, and I encourage those to just sit. If there's a grandmother in your house, or a grandfather, please go to her and ask her. And ask her those questions that she would be comfortable with. It could be sewing, it could be knitting, it could be food, or it could be, what role she played as an educator or as a political head.
And speaking of those difficult topics, I want to speak a little bit more about the inherited generational trauma. How do you think this has affected the community today?
Yeah, I think to a large extent, I think the Cockney community has not inherited a lot of its trauma, of that trauma, because many of our Cockney people were not involved with the struggles. I'm just thinking of Grassy Park. I remember the Rumani family here as well, who was strongly involved in the struggle. But I can count the amount of families. The Halfe family would be another that was involved, the Jule family as well. But there were few and far between. I've already mentioned the Kays family, where Mr. Kays was banned for 6 years under house arrest. My father only got a warning. So the trauma was not that serious, but it was the impact and the consequences of apartheid and the group areas which did result in trauma. So when you had people that had to leave Monte Vista or Constantia, or largely our Cockneys were in Claremont as well as in District 6, to leave with nothing. Now remember, the Indian community, largely the Cockney community, I said, were traders. So they were the shopkeepers on the corner. So there were many families of Cockney descent that played a pivotal role in our struggle history. Too many to mention, and I'm going to be in trouble if I'm going to mention. But immediately, sitting here in Grassy Park, I think of the Rumani family, the AK Rumani family, where all our meetings with Hisham Mohammed was held in their house. Zubaida Jaffer, Julie Jaffer, Mrs. Rahma Jaffer, Sulaiman Jaffer, the old man, Mr. Jaffer, we all would meet there. Then, of course, there's the Councillor Parker, Hussein Parker, the advocate, Hisham Mohammed, I've already mentioned, as well as the Khalfe brothers, both Ahmed Saab Khalfe and his cousin, the Jule family. And then there is Tasnim Khan's father. I can picture him, Dawood. I just can't come to his surname at the moment, but he too played a pivotal role in the struggle. Farida Ricketts, still a living heritage. Aisha Dawood Mukaddam from Worcester. So there are several people that had done a lot for the political struggle as well as their families had suffered traumatically. Coming back to the generational trauma, so as I had said, they were largely traders and their families who lived in areas such as District 6, Monte Vista, Claremont, several areas, Constantia as well, who then were then forced to remove through the Group Areas Act. My father was not a trader, he was a teacher. But the fact that those traders had to leave after establishing their businesses in a vibrant community,
Yes.
and then re-establish themselves with nothing was a painful story. Because they would say that, look what I got, I had to leave with whatever, we had nobody to cart our stuff, and we had to start over. So that was a painful story. I've related to you earlier about Mr. Kays, the poet, who was a journalist for the Post in District 6, and he too was arrested under house arrest for 6 years with no income. So there was that generational trauma, and the community took care of those that were imprisoned or incarcerated or under warnings. One point I needed to mention was that the Cockneys that lived in District 6 largely were traders, but you also had tenants living there. So you had a mixed bag of landowners and tenants. So everybody, so if you were not a trader but you were a tenant living with someone and you were evicted, you and your family suffered that generational trauma. And I think it was those who didn't have a trade that struggled along more. But thankfully you see the 80s, 90s, and you see the change. They were able to re-establish themselves, ensure that the children get educated, and in so doing, they uplifted their community.
Yeah. Just to finish off, something that I'm really passionate about is finding one's identity. And through, the Group Areas Act and the trek from India to South Africa, how has our concept of identity changed, and how can we hold on to our identity as South African Indians?
Yeah, that's a vexed question. So you have two sets of people. The one who says, I'm South African, don't ask me where I come from, I'm South African. And then you have the other person that says, I'm South African, but I acknowledge my roots. So you're somewhere between there. And I think what one needs to teach the younger generation is there is nothing wrong in celebrating your roots. And that is why Heritage Month is so important, because it takes us back. Yes, of course we are South African, but we're all different.
Yes.
If I'm Khoi and I'm a Khainakwa, I'm different to a Khoi that's a Griqua. And I'm different to a San. If I'm African, I'm different to a Sesotho, and I'm different to a Zulu. And they all celebrate themselves. Why do we want to run away from who we really are? Of course, as a nation we are South African, of course. And the beauty of celebrating your identity is so that it defines who you are. It explains to you who you are, why you talk in a particular way, why you cook in a particular way, why you follow certain customs and traditions. That is what your identity teaches you. And why is it so important to respect one's identity is so that I can respect you and your identity if it's different to mine. And in that way, I believe when we're celebrating our identity through our culture, our traditions, and our heritage, it fosters mutual respect. That's why I love Heritage Month, because it reminds us that we can build a nation if we heal, we redress the inequities of the past, and we move forward by recognizing that we are different, but we have mutual respect for celebrating our diversity.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me and sharing your vast knowledge that you have. I really enjoyed it, so thank you so much.
I just also want to say shukran to the management of Radio 786 and yourself, Fatima Hussein, for affording me this opportunity to talk on your Heritage series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.